So let me start with a little of the overview of phases. And how many of you know the work of Bion? How many of you are familiar with Bion? Okay. B-I-O-N. Wilfred Bion was a psychiatrist who worked in England. And he worked in England during the war. And what was very interesting was he worked with the soldiers that were coming home from the front. And at the time he was working with them, the culture in England was very much that you took your citizenship and you joined the army and you fought for your country. And that was an expected, accepted norm in the country. And it was a highly valued norm. So that you didn't really dare say, I don't want to fight. And you didn't dare say, I don't want to serve. And you certainly didn't dare say, I've lost my nerve in a way. Because what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, at the time they called battlefield fatigue. So what happened was Bion was a psychiatrist working in the hospital with the soldiers who got sent home from the front with battlefield fatigue. And the goal was to rehab them in the hospital so they could go back to the front. And there was no way in the British culture at that time that they could say, I don't want to go back to the front. There was no way they could do that. They would completely lose face and completely lose a sense of themselves as being a citizen to their country. So what Bion noticed, which is turned out to have profound impact for all of us in the group dynamics world, is Bion began to notice that the soldiers said, oh yes, we want to get better and go back and fight. They said that all the time. But if you watch their behavior, they did not behave as if they wanted to. So they would sit around, they wouldn't participate in the ward activities, they didn't take up their roles and responsibilities as part of the unit. So all of the behavior, if you watch the behavior, it indicated no desire to get better and return to fight. On the other hand, all of the words indicated that they did. So that was the beginning of understanding the difference between an explicit goal and an implicit goal. So the behavior will always reflect the implicit goal. The words will reflect the explicit goal. And when there is a contradiction between the implicit goal and the explicit goal, which one do you think wins?
Implicit.
Implicit, every time. Implicit will trump explicit. Okay. Now, the other thing Bion went on to do is, as he worked with the groups on the ward, is he essentially formulated what he called basic assumptions of group life. And he said the basic assumptions of group life are flight, fight, pairing, and dependency. And what he did was he really said that until a group has managed the tensions in those basic group assumptions, the group will not be able to take up its work task. So until the group has managed the tensions and the basic assumptions that every group has, it will not be able to take up its work task. Yeah. And so Bion did his work, in England during the war, and then in the 1950s, the sort of next significant event for thinking phases was Binnis and Shepard. And Binnis and Shepard were Americans, and they were teaching in an American university, and they were teaching group dynamics. Now, the culture in the mid-50s in American universities was you had a podium like the one we have at the back of the room there, and the teacher would come in and stand at the podium, and the chairs would be in rows, and the students would take notes and listen. So they were teaching group dynamics, so they went in and they put the chairs in a circle, much like we have now. And they sat in the circle themselves, and they didn't speak. The two group leaders, they didn't speak. And I think the class lasted 12 weeks. So they sat silent for 12 weeks. And they watched what happened in the groups. And they did this over and over again, I think for about 4 or 5 years. And they collected data on what they called a theory of group development. And they used Bion's basic assumptions as sort of their guiding framework to watch the group. But what they added was the idea that groups left to their own devices will go through predictable phases of development that they could see after a time, and that happened in each of the groups that they did. And you know, what they also did was they created a leadership vacuum, so that then the group development dynamics dominated the group, because there was no leadership to structure or manage the group dynamics. So then they really could see the group development in a way more in its pure form. Now, Binnis and Shepard were one of the early formulators of phases of group development, and they are also the phases that Yvonne built on when she developed the phases of system development. So Binnis and Shepard's phases are very embedded in ours, or ours are embedded in theirs. And for any of you who like reading about phases, the paper that does two things very well. It makes the links to the Binnis and Shepard phases, but it also makes a very good link between psychodynamics and system-centered, and that is the phases of group development paper that was originally published in the Ring of Fire book by Malcolm Pines and Victor Schirmer, but is also republished in Yvonne's selected papers in Clinical Practice book, the green and white one, which was published about 2 years ago. So that is, if you are interested in the sort of origins and connections to Binnis and Shepard, or interested in the cross between psychodynamics and system-centered dynamics, that paper particularly bridges those two. So that's the backdrop of us system-centered beginning to work with phases. Then the other thing that had a major influence on how Yvonne began to think about phases was the work that Kurt Lewin did, the social psychologist. And Kurt Lewin basically introduced a couple of ideas that are very important to us in SCT. He introduced the idea of a life space. And in the life space, Kurt Lewin would say there's a goal, and there will be let's see if I can draw a good life space. So Kurt Lewin would do something like, say, here's the person, and the person's life space is their perception of their world, and the person's goal is here. And on the path to the goal, the person will run into all kinds of barriers and have to find their way through and around the barriers in order to get to the goal. Now, also in this idea of the life space, which is very useful for us, because the life space really is like a context. It's like a system context. He didn't use the word system, but it's very easy to think of it that way. The other thing about this is he said, on the path to goal, you can identify the predictable set of, let's do two colors, driving and restraining forces along the path to goal. And to the extent that the driving forces continue to get released, the system will ultimately reach its goal. And what Kurt Lewin introduced was a really central idea that we use in SCT. The idea that the extent to which the driving forces get released will depend on how well we, in fact, weaken the restraining forces. And every time we weaken a restraining force, we free driving forces.